difficult, but if you want time to look at all three. So if you need to do that, let's just look at it now so we can kind of plan our day tomorrow. So, yeah, maybe we should talk about all of them, right? Yeah, let's do that. So we'll take some more time, right? Let's take like 5-10 minutes to talk about each one. So please tonight kind of get your ideas organized in your head so that you're ready to share them with somebody tomorrow and debate them. Okay? All right. So let's get into chapter 8 then. So lexicon means what? Yeah. So an important point too. Is this word countable or uncountable?
Countable.
It's actually not. Yeah, it's actually uncountable.
Uncountable.
Yeah. So therefore,
Is it a word lexicon too? But I check it up in dictionary. It's not lexicon.
in the plural,
Lexicon is okay.
yeah, lexica can be plural. It comes from Latin, so it's irregular. You don't have an S. Like criterion, criteria, right? So if vocabulary as a word is not countable, therefore we can't have the what? Plural form, right? There is no plural, so you can't say I teach vocabularies.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist, right? I teach words, right? I teach words. I have a vocabulary lesson, but I don't teach vocabularies, okay? So it's not countable. So they say that lexical errors are more serious than grammatical errors. Why? Why do you think?
Because when we make some grammatical error, maybe people still can understand what we say, but when we make some lexical error, they really don't know the meaning of the words, and they can misunderstand it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Example would be something like I rise eat today.
I what?
I rise eat today. You should be able to understand.
Absolutely. I rise to eat today. Okay, the order is wrong, the grammar is wrong, but I still understood it perfectly, right? But if you say, I do rice today, I don't know what you mean, right? Did you make it, or did you eat it, or did you grow it? I'm not sure, right? So it causes more lack of communication, right? And so our focus as language learners is to be able to communicate. Maybe we'll make some mistakes, we probably will, but we need to get our ideas across. That's the most important. So words are what represent our ideas, and so that's why it's so important. However, lexical errors are the most common. Isn't that interesting? So it's a big problem, isn't it, right? It causes the most confusion. So that's where we need to be the most careful about it. And where do we usually focus our time as English teachers? Do we usually focus on vocabulary? What would you say the majority of your time is spent on?
When we teach English, yes, we spend more of the time on the vocabulary.
Do you? Yeah. Do you agree?
Some lessons like teaching reading, so they spend like 15 minutes.
Okay. All right.
So when we teach them subject from math and science, then we correct them.
Good point. Absolutely. It's very, very important, right? The correct term is so important. It's very precise, right? It has meaning. And if you use a different term, you mean something else. And so in something precise like math or science, it absolutely has to be correct. But in language in general, there's misunderstanding if you use the wrong word. That's kind of a pet peeve of mine, is that I think that a lot of times people use pronouns kind of willy-nilly. Do you know that expression, willy-nilly? You know this? This is a good expression. Do you know that? They use pronouns kind of willy-nilly. It means like just any way. So they say, oh, that guy, he said blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, what guy? You know, that guy, like as if I know inside their brain what that refers to, right? People do that all the time, and they say, oh, you didn't give me that assignment, right? That assignment. Which assignment? Like, you're supposed to be following their thought inside their brain. You have no context, suddenly they come up with a pronoun, and you don't know what it refers to, right? So it has to have a clear reference. So, you're saying that you focus mostly on vocabulary. That's great. I think in a lot of situations, teachers focus mostly on grammar. So each context is different. In different scenarios, people teach in different ways. I think a focus on vocabulary is very, very important. As we can see, it's the most important for transferring meaning, right? For communication, for understanding. Grammar is important too. Pronunciation is important too. Reading, listening, speaking, they're all important. But if you don't have the words to express your ideas, you can't communicate. So there's actually a method for teaching called the lexical approach that was developed in the 90s, and it focuses on vocabulary. And that's the theory, is that the most important thing is words. So we need people to have words so that they can communicate. Maybe they'll make mistakes, but they'll be able to get their ideas across. So that's the lexical approach.
Lexis just mean words, right?
Words. Yep. Lexis means words or vocabulary. So this person said that the threshold to reading comprehension is lexical. Like being able to understand reading is based on your vocabulary. It's not based as much on grammar. It's more based on your vocabulary. If you can understand the words, you can kind of decode the message. You can understand what's there. So this is slightly different than what's in your book. The way they organized it, I think they just use form, use, and meaning in your book. But I like this because it's an acronym, so you can remember it. So FUMP, right? If you just remember FUMP. What does it mean to know a word? We talked about that yesterday. We said that there are many, many levels to knowing a word, right? We can know the connotation. What was connotation?
General meaning.
Was it general meaning?
Meaning in different contexts.
Yes.
Yeah, meaning used in
Situation.
There was another word I used for it. Feeling. Yeah, it's the feeling, right? Is it positive or negative? Does it have a good feeling or a negative feeling? That's the connotation of the word. So that's a very deep level of meaning, right? That's a very good understanding of the word. Usually we get to that later. We don't give students all the information at the very beginning. You don't give them all 6 definitions. Usually they learn one definition first, right? And then later they'll learn more. And later they'll learn the connotation. What else do you need to know? You need to know the spelling. You need to know the pronunciation. You need to know the context. Where can you use it? When can you use it? You need to know the form. How can you make it? Is it a verb? Is it regular? Is it irregular? Can it be used as a gerund, right? So how can you change the form and use it? So there's much to what it means to know a word, right? So we can talk about form, use, meaning, and pronunciation. In your book, I think they put pronunciation together with form, and I disagree with that. I don't think pronunciation goes under form. Does that make sense to you? In your book, in your textbook, yeah. I think they put pronunciation together with form, and to me that didn't make sense, but I prefer to separate it out.
So according to this one, form, just about spelling. Just the spelling.
Well, so form is not only spelling, but it's which morpheme do you add to the word, right? So do you add S or do you add IES, right, if you're going to make the plural? That has to do with form. Is it a regular or irregular verb, right? That's form. So spelling is part of form. So this guy Nation, he's the most famous guy in terms of vocabulary. He's done so much research, so many articles he's produced based on vocabulary. He's really well known for vocabulary research. So he's an important name to know. So in the book there was another study, and they talked about 3 types of vocabulary knowledge. So this is a different way of looking at what does it mean to know a word, right? There are different people with different ideas. And so these people said that there are 3 different ways. One way is passive knowledge, and that's the most frequent meaning. So like we said, when you look a word up in the dictionary and there's sometimes 4, 5, 6 definitions, so passive knowledge would be that you understand the first one, right? You have a very general understanding of the meaning of the word. A controlled active knowledge would mean that you can recall the word if somebody gives you a hint or a cue, right? So they give you some kind of a scenario or a fill in the blank or a picture and you need to do a matching. They give you some kind of a cue and then you can remember the word, right? So that's cued recall, controlled active knowledge. So it's active, you can use the word, but there's still some control that needs to be there. It's not just spontaneous free use, which is the last step. So free active knowledge means that the word is yours, you really know it, and you can use it when you want to, right? So like the other day, for example, I used the word substantiate, and then you asked me after class, what does that mean exactly? Oh, substantiate, how do you spell that? What's the pronunciation? Right? And so now I've used that word over 3, 4 days, and now I think that you probably can use it part of your free active knowledge, right? On the first day, it was probably passive knowledge. Maybe you have seen it before, you could understand from the context, right? Substance, substantiate, to make like substance, right?
I think substantiate is a passive knowledge to me.
Is it? Yeah? Okay. Well, eventually we'll get to free active. This is the idea, right? So with more and more exposure, eventually we'll get to free active. So it happens in phases, right? At the beginning, of course, it's passive. And then eventually it becomes productive knowledge. You can use it. So another pair of researchers came up with this idea of knowledge and control. So what they said about knowing a word, there's 2 different ways of looking at it. You can look at knowledge, which means how the language system is represented in your long-term memory. How do you code it? Where is it there inside your brain? And we talked a little bit about chunking, about making groups of words, right? This is a form of storing information in your long-term memory, right? So how can you access it? Are the files in your long-term memory really nice and neat in alphabetical order? Or is it a mess, right? And you just can't find things when you're looking for it. It's like it's in there somewhere. That's the way I feel sometimes, right? I've read so many books and I just can't remember where I read it. It's like, oh, I read something somewhere, but I don't have it nicely organized in my long-term memory to be able to retrieve it when I need it. Right? So how is it represented in your long-term memory? Can you access it? And then control is the processing system during performance. What do you think this means? Any idea? What kind of processing system do you think we're talking about? So we're talking about long-term memory. Where is long-term memory? Yeah, it's cognitive. It's in the brain. It's in the mind. So what kind of processing?
Cognitive.
Yeah, mental processing, right? Cognitive processing. So how does your brain process? At the moment that you're using it, right? Performance is use. So when you have receptive knowledge or passive knowledge, you're not using it actively, you're not performing, right? So, when you really know a word, you have some control over it. You're able to pick it and choose it and use it when you want to, and use it in the correct form. You conjugate it correctly or use it in the right context. So they make this distinction between storing the information, which is knowledge, and control, which is use or production. Okay? So it's all different ways of looking at the same thing, right? Everybody comes up with a slightly different idea. You have different theorists, and these guys say, well, this is my idea. This is the way I see it. So that's why we ask you in the CLAs, well, what do you think? Your idea is just as good as theirs. Why is theirs any better than yours? How do you see it? Language learners need to interpret meaning based on real-world context. This is a lot more interesting for being able to use a word is if you have a real-world situation where you can connect it to. Then you can kind of understand the meaning of the word. You can have better control over selecting which items to use. That's why it's so important to use authentic materials in the classroom, to expose students to real newspapers or real magazines or real dialogues. Because the artificial dialogues that are made for textbooks, it's not the language that you hear in day-to-day life, right? So then they're not really going to feel comfortable about using the word. But if they can interpret meaning and understand meaning in real-world context, they're more likely to be able to use the word correctly later with spontaneous use. So meaning is not static. That means it's not fixed. So although we look up a word in a dictionary and we see the definition of it, sometimes it can change a little bit based on the context or the situation. For example, when you said the other day, the girl said, oh, you look so skinny, right? In that context, it had a positive connotation. In another context, it might have a negative connotation. So the meaning changes slightly, right? It's a process. Everything in life is alive and moving. It's not static, right? It doesn't just stay put. This is one thing that makes science so difficult, and especially the science of the humanities. When we're trying to study people and the human mind and something abstract like language, it's very, very difficult because it's not something that we're observing like in a biology or a chemistry experiment. You can't keep it in a petri dish. Right? It moves, it grows, it changes. There are millions of variables that affect it, right? You have culture and age and background and history and personality and so many things. So it's really, really complex, right? We're trying to understand it as best as we can by breaking away the different variables, but it's really a complex process. So meaning is also a process. It's based on the real world context. So these processes need to be learned, or they need to be taught. You need to be aware of this at a conscious level. We understand it subconsciously, but we need to make it conscious. It's similar to what I was talking about earlier about the test-taking strategies. So maybe you have some strategies when you take a test, but maybe you haven't formalized them. It's similar to note-taking strategies or studying strategies. How do you take notes? Do you make them color-coded? Do you like to write down everything that you hear? Because otherwise I won't remember it 10 minutes later if I don't write it down, right? Some people, they can just sit and listen and they can remember everything. Do you like to type it up, or do you prefer to write it? I prefer to write it because I'm more likely to read it and go back in my notebook. If it's on my computer, I'm not likely to go back and read those notes. So I know that about myself. Right? So it becomes a conscious process. So we need to educate students about this process of meaning too, of constructing meaning. So it's not something that people know automatically. It's something that you need to learn and to be aware of. So obviously there's varying degrees of control over these processes. The more you are conscious of something, the more you can control it. Right? There's a lot of variables, a lot of processes, so you might not be able to control everything, and you control everything in different degrees depending on your comfort. There's another concept, another way of looking at vocabulary, and that's looking at the breadth versus the depth. So breadth is kind of like quantity. Breadth is the width, right? How many words do you know? Do you know a lot of words? But maybe you know a lot of words very superficially. You don't know all the subtle levels. You don't know connotation. You don't know pronunciation. You don't know derivation, right? There's so much to know about it. So depth is knowing more and more about the word, right? So it's a lot of knowledge. It goes deeper and deeper. So from the research, what they find is that lexical patterns do tend to transfer from the L1 to the L2. For example, they gave the example in the textbook of reflexives. And in French, they use a lot of reflexives, like reflexive verbs. So when you say you're going to wash up, right? You're going to wash your hands. You're saying, I'm going to wash myself. In French, right? Je me lave. But in English, we don't say that, right? We just say, I'm going to wash up. You could say, I'm going to wash myself, but it's unusual, right? We normally don't say that. Maybe, depending on the context, you want to make it clear, I'm going to wash myself, and you wash yourself. I'm not going to wash you, right? Or a little baby wants to tell the mama, no, I'm going to wash myself. I'm going to do it myself, right? When they're 2 years old and they want to be independent. So based on the context, you might say it. But French native speakers tend to use that lexical structure in the L2. They tend to transfer L1 structures in terms of lexicon. How you use words, they tend to translate. Okay? So I told you that we would talk a lot about strategies. Do you guys have any questions so far? Do you remember I told you on the first day, please be sure to interrupt me, ask questions, feel free, just don't let me continue talking. If you're lost, let me know, raise your hand, say, whoa, stop, I didn't get that idea. Or if you want to add something, please.
Can you please give us some more examples on the lexical patterns transferring from L1 to L2?
Sure. We did the example yesterday, we talked a little bit about idiomatic expressions, right? And so idiomatic expressions generally don't translate, right? But sometimes people try to do that. I gave the example of rise and shine yesterday, right? And you might want to try and translate that into another language. Like you have this expression in your mind, and people will try and transfer it, but sometimes it doesn't work. That's another example. Let's say also with, think of another one. So, in Spanish, when you want to say something like, give it to me, you can take the direct object and the indirect object and attach it to the verb. You say, dámelo. Da is give, me is me, and lo is it. So give me it. Dámelo. You make one word, right?
Follow the order.
Huh?
Follow the order.
Follow the order of, but they make one word. Dámela would be feminine, right? So it's dámelo. They can make one word out of it, right? And so they might have trouble in English, give it to me. In English we could say it two ways, right? We could say give me it or give it to me. So they would have, this form would be easy for them. They would transfer this from their L1 to English. That would be easy. But they would have difficulty forming this structure, give it to me, because they don't use it this way.
Yeah, just like similar in Vietnamese, say, buy me a dress. For example, but the students ask, teacher, why buy me, buy a dress, why buy me? You said buy a dress for me.
Okay.
It sounds okay for Vietnamese learners.
Okay.
They say buy me a dress, they don't feel
Good.
they don't feel easy.
All right, great. So it's always nice when you can come up with examples from Vietnamese, then it becomes clear, right?
Yes.
You can understand yourself. So that's the idea. Okay. Sure. So I said that we were going to talk about strategies today, right? About vocabulary teaching strategies.
Excuse me, but the examples we have just talked about is about lexical or about grammar?
Well, they overlap a little bit, don't they? Yeah, they overlap. It's kind of hard to extract vocabulary without talking about grammar. Sometimes it occurs, right? Yeah. It's a lexical pattern is what we're talking about, so it has to do with grammar. Like phrasal verb, for example, wake up. You know, how do you translate that into another language? Because you have the particle up. The particle is lexical, right? But when we translate it, how do you translate a phrasal verb? It becomes complicated. What?
It's usually if you take 1 or 2 minutes, talk more, a little bit more in depth about form, use, meaning, and pronunciation.
Sure, yeah. We'll go back to FUMP, right?
The book I read, some part is not really.
What page was that on? I agree with you. Yeah, that's why I gave you FUMP instead of what they said in the book. I didn't think it was very clear either.
It's page 196.
196. So will you guys look at that, please? On page 196. So they break it down into only form, meaning, and use, right? They didn't put pronunciation as a separate category. And they said form includes what does the word sound like? Do you agree? Yeah, so do you agree that that's part of form?
So he means the spoken form.
Yeah.
Spoken form is the pronunciation.
And we have the written form, so it doesn't,
The written
right?
form is the spelling.
Yeah, right. So they're talking about the spoken form and the written form. But I think that there's more to form than pronunciation or spelling, because we have the morphemes that also affect form, right?
That is a written form. The morphemes is about the.
It's spoken to. Well, of course, we use morphemes when we speak, sure, right? Because we use verbs in the past, or we use the ing form. We use possessives when we speak, right? So the FUMP that I gave you, the form, use, meaning, and pronunciation, is slightly different because it takes pronunciation out of form. I see it as being separate. For me, I see form as being related to morphemes. So it's the correct usage in the correct situation, right? You have the right form of the word in the right context.
Really pleased with the
Okay.
the meaning.
All right. So what's your specific question about meaning?
So in the meaning is including the form and the meaning also.
Form and meaning. What is the meaning of a particular form? Okay, yeah, so the meaning might change a little bit, right? Like let's say we're looking at the past tense of a verb. So you talk about eat and ate, right? It changes the form and it changes the meaning as well, right? So they overlap a little bit. It's not really a clear separation. Meaning is definition, right? What does it mean? But the meaning might be influenced by the form. Is it eating? I mean, the meaning is slightly different, right?
And it has one word, I say association. What words do we think of when we hear this form?
Okay.
So basically, we think about all the words that go with it.
Yeah.
So is that should be used? should I put under the use?
Good point. Good point.
I'm very confused because they are.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that fits better under use. Like yesterday in the lesson with the vocabulary with the cooking utensils, right? So we have the verbs too. So you have a ladle and you want to spoon out, right? Or a whisk. And so you're making an association between the noun and the verb that needs to be used. So that has more to do with use than with meaning, right? It does overlap a little bit because maybe you have a choice of different verbs that you want to use with a noun, but it's a restricted set. You can't use all the verbs. You can use, like, let's say, for example, 3 verbs with 1 noun. And so depending on which verb you choose is going to influence your meaning, right? So it can be influenced by the context in terms of what you want to say. Okay, great, thanks. Any other questions so far? All right, so we'll go back to strategy. So like we talked about test-taking strategies and note-taking strategies, right? So there's strategies for the skills. And word associations, so like we just talked about with the noun and the verb, words that go together are a type of association. And so this is a way of helping to store the information in our mind. Yesterday you used a mind map, right? You used a graphic organizer. And so these visual representations are helpful ways of being able to remember vocabulary. So if you could see which words go together, like for example, if we talk about the seasons. So if we talk about the seasons in the United States, what are they?
Spring, summer,
So let's take, for example, fall. What kind of words do you associate with fall?
leaves.
Leaves.
Great.
So you think of leaves, and what else?
Rake.
Rake. Leaves, rake goes with leaves, doesn't it? What else?
Fishing.
Fishing.
Stop.
Thank you. What do you think of?
Full Moon Festival.
Full Moon Festival.
So Halloween too.
Halloween also.
All right.
Halloween, that's the end of
Halloween.
fall, right?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's not good.
And so what do you think of when you think of Full Moon Festival?
If you are
Lantern.
Lantern.
Mooncake.
Buổi ăn khổ. Buổi ăn
Lion dance.
Lion dance.
All right. So this is a mind map, right? And so this shows word associations. How do you make connections between words? It's a great idea for people to be able to remember vocabulary, right? Because they can see the connection, how things work together. And it helps them for later retrieval. They can remember it when we do it in this way. Graphic organizers, visual representations, pictures, images, videos, colors really help us to be able to retrieve information later. You guys know about multiple intelligences, right? About the different styles of learning. If people are more visual or auditory or, what's the other one? Tactile, kinesthetic, right? Yeah, so
Spatial.
spatial. What else? Do you know some of the others? There's musical, logical, mathematical, right? So we have different types of learners and people learn in different ways. But which one do you think is the most predominant?
Visual and audio.
Visual. Visual is the most common. About 80% of the population is visual dominant. Yeah, big percentage, right? So everybody has all the different kinds of
Maybe
intelligences.
2 intelligences in one person.
You have all of them. You have all of them, but to varying degrees. So some might be very low, right? Some might be very high. Some might be the same across the board. There are people who are multi-talented who have all about the same, right? But in general, people tend to be visual dominant. And especially if you just look at the senses of like being an auditory, visual, or kinesthetic learner. If you look at those three, definitely the majority is visual. So any kind of visual support that we can use is really helpful for retrieval. That's why graphic organizers are so nice for vocabulary learning, right? So it's what we call an anchor, right? It's an anchor in the mind for this information. Yeah, it locks it in there. It stays stuck at a certain place. It holds it down. The IPA symbols are a type of visual representation of the sound. So if you can see the symbol, you can imagine the sound in your mind, you can hear it, right? You can make an association with a word that you know that has that symbol in it. So that's also a kind of anchor for pronunciation. So these kinds of visual images are really helpful. So this creates a network that helps for later retrieval. So do you ever work with prefixes and suffixes as a strategy for language teaching? You do? Yeah. How do you do it?
We'll teach them the frequent suffixes and the prefixes.
Okay. What do suffixes do to a word?
Change the form.
They change the form, therefore they change,
The
right?
meaning.
Does it change the meaning? So we talk about, for example, walk, walked, right?
Is it form?
It's form. It's meaning a little bit, because we just talked about that, right? We just said it changes a little bit, right? But let's say if you have comprehensible and incomprehensible, if we use a prefix, what does that do? Does that change the meaning, right? So prefixes are associated with changing meaning. They change the definition. Suffixes change the form and change the meaning a little bit, okay? But mainly they change the form. That's their job. This is a great way of increasing vocabulary, helping students with reading comprehension, and helping them to be able to use a strategy to understand new words that they find. Yesterday we said that what percentage of English was influenced by Latin? 80%. 80% of English comes from a Latin root or another language that has Latin. So we have borrowed words from French, from Italian, right? So if you know some Latin roots, then it's very easy to understand different words, right? And what they mean when you encounter a new word. Like, for example, and the other main influence in English is Greek, right, in terms of our roots in English. So we have a large influence from Latin and Greek. So if you have, for example, do you know this root? What does it mean?
Study.
It's the study of. So if you know that, then we know that biology is the study of life, right? Bio means life. And if we have this prefix, we know that it's the study of the earth, right? And if we have this prefix, we know that it's the study of society, right? And if we have this prefix, it's the study of the mind. Psyche means mind, psyche, right? So, yeah, psyche is mind. So can you see how useful this is in terms of a strategy for vocabulary building? Right, if you know a root, then you can figure out the meaning of a word when you know other prefixes. Or you can figure out the part of speech if you know the suffixes. You know if it changes from a verb to a noun, for example. Right, if you add a different suffix, you can change the part of speech entirely. Do I need to give some examples of suffixes, or do you know that?
You know.
You know that. Okay. So contextual guessing, do you know this strategy?
Based on context.
The words around.
Yeah, based on the context, usually for reading. It happens with speaking too, though, sometimes, right? But based on the situation, based on the other words that are being used, we can make a guess about the meaning. This is really important for second language learners because sometimes they feel very dependent to look every word up in the dictionary. Dictionary is a strategy too. Looking up words in the dictionary is a strategy for knowledge. The more that you see a word and the more invested you become in learning that word, the more likely you are to remember it. So if you do some work to look it up in the dictionary, you're more likely to remember than if the teacher just gives you the definition. But sometimes we need to save time. You can't look up every single new word in the dictionary. It takes forever, right? So contextual guessing is a really important strategy to teach your students in terms of vocabulary learning. We talked about chunking already, right? About grouping words together. Do you ever use personal dictionaries where you have your students make their own dictionaries? There's some really nice, do you do it?
One student, they have their own vocabulary.
Okay. And what kinds of information do they put in it?
All vocabularies. Each subject.
Okay. So you can organize it by subject. If you're a content teacher and you're teaching math and chemistry, they can organize it according to the different topics. And they can put all different kinds of things. So they can put the definition. They can draw a picture, so they have that visual representation. They can put the pronunciation. They can put the IPA symbols. What else can they put? Example sentence. How do you use it? Right? They could put the different suffixes. How do you change it? How do you make different combinations with this word? Right? So this is also, I said that the more investment they have in learning the word, the more likely they are to remember it. So you can get, you know, like a blank phone book where it's got the alphabet in it, and they can create their own personal dictionary. And it's really nice if they draw pictures and make it really colorful. It's a great strategy. Cognates we talked about yesterday. Cognates are, what's the definition? They have the same roots, so therefore you recognize it in another language. So if we have a word in English that comes from Spanish, and I know Spanish, I'll recognize that word because it looks similar. However, there are some words that are false cognates. Yeah. Like, for example, there's one word in Spanish. What do you think that looks like? It looks like embarrassed, doesn't it? You would think that it's a cognate of embarrassed. However, it's a false cognate. It looks like embarrassed, but it means pregnant. So you don't want to say, oh, I was so muy embarazada. I was very embarrassed, right? No, I was very pregnant.
When you're pregnant, when you feel embarrassed.
Depending on the context, right? I didn't know.
It's still linked somehow.
It could happen. Yeah. But so you need to be careful. Not everything that looks like what you think means what you think. You need to be careful. And usually they're embarrassing. Right? Usually you say it and it means a bad word or something like that.
So in the context with something, the two languages share the similar roots.
Exactly.
Not in one language.
Yeah. Either they share a similar root or we have a borrowed word from that language in our language. We have assimilated it into our language. But that's usually what it's from, is that we have a similar root.
Can you give me another example of cognate?
Yeah, sure. So,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Okay, so in Portuguese, this word inferência, what do you think it means in English? Inference. Right? Portuguese.
Psychology.
Psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah. Psychology. Right?
Psychology.
Right? So the pronunciation, if you hear it, you might not recognize it, right? You say psicologia,
Oh.
right? It doesn't look like what it sounds like, right? But if you say it written, psicologia.
Dia,
So
dia.
the G is not H.
Yeah, in Spanish they don't say the G, it sounds like an H.
Gia.
Yeah.
Dia.
In Portuguese they would say the G, psicologia. In Spanish, psicologia. G sounds like H.
San Jose, San